Imagine you are seated at the world's most chaotic dinner party.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
Right. So you are at this incredibly long, beautifully decorated table, but there is a major problem. Every single person around you is just shouting at the top of their lungs.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they're waving their hands, passionately defending their opinions, and, coming armed with this barrage of statistics, anecdotes, foolproof arguments. The noise is absolutely deafening, and the tension in the room is it's suffocating.
And I bet if you were to ask any single one of those guests, they would tell you with absolute certainty that they are the only one in the room who is completely right.
Exactly. Everyone is right. Everyone has a point. But here is the bizarre, really unsettling part about this dinner party. Despite all the shouting, despite all this supposed unshakable truth being thrown around the room, your stomach is growling. You look around and you realize that no one is actually eating. The plates are completely empty. Everyone is so aggressively busy talking that, everyone is slowly starving to death.
Which, honestly, serves as the perfect image of a very modern kind of malnutrition.
Yeah.
Because we live in an era where we are stuffed to the brim with information and data points, but we are fundamentally starved for meaning and connection.
And that is exactly why you are here with us today. We know you. You are the learner. You're the kind of person who is constantly seeking a deep, structured understanding of the world. But if you're being completely honest, you are also profoundly exhausted by the constant, deafening noise of modern life.
Right. You don't want another hot take.
No, definitely not another debate to win. You want to know how to actually cut through all that static to find genuine truth and maybe, just maybe, uncover a bit of spiritual awareness along the way.
It is a pretty ambitious mission for our deep dive today, but we are pulling from a stack of profound philosophical writings that tackle this exact modern malnutrition. They offer a completely different framework for understanding how we communicate and really how we perceive the world.
We really do have a fascinating roadmap ahead. These texts argue that everything from our everyday workplace conversations to literally the next meal you eat can be viewed as profound spiritual trials, if you know how to look at them.
Yeah, it's a huge perspective shift.
It is. And I'm going to make a promise to you right now. By the time we finish unpacking these sources, your baseline perspective on what it means to interact with the world around you is going to significantly shift.
Because the philosophy we are analyzing today asks us to fundamentally rethink the mechanics of how truth operates, starting with, how we use our words.
Okay, let's unpack this. The writings kick off by addressing that dinner party metaphor we just talked about, though the text refers to the earth as a, quote, crowded square.
Right.
It presents this really vivid picture. Everyone is speaking, everyone is explaining, everyone is technically right, and yet somehow the human heart is rarely filled. When I read that, I instantly thought of scrolling through a modern social media feed.
Oh, absolutely. Or, sitting in one of those chaotic workplace meetings where everyone is just trying to prove their worth to the boss.
Yes. Everyone is talking, everyone is technically making valid points, but absolutely no one is connecting on a human level.
What's fascinating here is the text's diagnosis of why this actually happens. It draws a stark distinction between volume and resonance.
Volume and resonance.
Right. Because we tend to operate under this societal assumption that if we just speak louder or, if we just provide a more overwhelming avalanche of data points, the truth will somehow physically force its way into the other person's mind.
Like we can bludgeon them with facts.
Exactly. But the underlying philosophy of these sources argues the exact opposite. It suggests that truth does not arrive by shouting. It reveals itself through a quiet sentence or, sometimes incredibly, through absolute silence.
Silence. I mean, in a modern culture that constantly tells us silence means you're weak or that silence means you're actively losing the argument, that is a radical concept.
It really is. And the text poses this incredibly provocative question that forces you to pause. It asks, what can be said to a true word?
I kept stopping at that line. What can be said to a true word? If you think about the actual mechanics of that, it means a genuine truth doesn't leave any loose ends for someone else to pull at.
Precisely. If a word is genuinely true within this framework, it is already complete in its essence.
Right.
When someone speaks a profound, grounded truth, the natural human reaction isn't to immediately fire back with a rebuttal or a counterargument.
You don't just start debating it.
No, the natural reaction is to just pause. The philosophy argues that a true word doesn't demand objection, it demands alignment.
Which makes total psychological sense. Imagine you're standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon for the very first time. You don't look out at this massive, awe-inspiring geological wonder and say, well, actually, I think the erosion patterns are slightly derivative.
Right. You'd sound ridiculous.
You just stand there in silence. You align your internal state with the undeniable reality of what's right in front of you.
Building on that, the source makes a brilliant observation about our modern psychological reflexes. It points out our conditioned rush to always have an answer for everything.
Oh, man.
We view every single statement made by another person as a tennis ball that we are obligated to hit back over the net.
Yeah, got to keep the rally going.
Exactly. But the text suggests that in the presence of actual truth, we have to voluntarily surrender that reflex. It proposes that at times, a person must be willing to give up the need to be right in order to draw nearer to what is true.
Giving up the need to be right is a massive ask for a lot of people.
It's huge.
For so many of us, especially in professional environments, our entire identity is heavily wrapped up in being the smartest person in the room. Think about your own life, listener. How many times have you fired off a long text message or an aggressive email just to ensure you got the last word, only to realize later that it didn't actually resolve the conflict at all?
And that highlights the massive cost of that defense mechanism. The text argues that what truly burdens a person in life isn't the truth itself, it is the elaborate, exhausting defenses they construct while fleeing from it.
Wow.
Yeah. When you give up that desperate, ego-driven need to always have the last word, this philosophy says you aren't making yourself smaller or weaker. You are actually freeing yourself from an unnecessary psychological burden.
You're finally putting down the heavy armor.
Exactly.
Wait, let me push back on this a little bit, because a phrase we hear constantly in modern psychology and self-help, and the text even acknowledges this phrase, is words are the interpreter of the heart.
Sure.
We are explicitly taught to speak our truth, to not bottle things up and to let it all out. So if I'm feeling deeply angry or resentful or conflicted about something, shouldn't I just say exactly what I feel? Doesn't keeping that quiet just lead to burying the conflict and being inauthentic?
That is the exact trap the text anticipates and warns against. It does agree that words are the interpreter of the heart. However, the source provides a massive, crucial caveat.
Which is?
If the heart itself is not clear, if it is clouded by raw, unprocessed emotion, those words are just empty ornaments. They are not truth.
But if modern psychology tells us that suppressing our feelings leads to deep resentment, aren't I doing damage by just staying quiet when someone blatantly wrongs me?
Well, this raises an important question about the difference between internal processing and external weaponization.
Okay, external weaponization.
Right. The philosophy here isn't advocating for the unhealthy suppression of emotion.
Ooh.
It is arguing against the immediate reactive dumping of chaos onto someone else.
That makes sense.
If your internal state is turbulent, projecting that turbulence outward via angry words doesn't suddenly synthesize truth. It just adds more meaningless noise to the crowded square.
Just more shouting at the dinner party.
Precisely. So the text introduces a dual requirement for arriving at actual truth. It requires both expertise and companionship.
Expertise and companionship. Break down how those two things act as the mechanism for truth.
The source states, and this is a quote, "The expert shows us the map. Companionship teaches us how to walk together."
I like that.
If you only have expertise, just cold, hard facts delivered without empathy, words grow incredibly heavy and people naturally withdraw from you. It ceases to be a conversation and becomes like clinical lecture.
It's the difference between reading a dense topographical map of a mountain and actually having a friend walk alongside you on the trail. If I just hand you the map and yell at you to figure it out, you're going to hate the hike.
Exactly. And on the flip side, if you only have casual companionship, if you are just exchanging unstructured vibes and raw feelings without any grounding in reality or expertise, the text notes that measure loosens and meaning scatters.
You feel good, but you're lost.
Right. You might feel heard in the moment, but you aren't actually heading anywhere true. Therefore, truth must be both authentic and alive. It must emerge genuinely from the heart, be rigorously weighed by the mind, and then practically tested in the reality of life.
Weighed by the mind. I love the imagery of that phrasing. It implies a deliberate, conscious filtration process before the words are ever allowed to leave your mouth.
Yes.
And that concept connects perfectly to a quote. The text drops from the ancient poet Eunice Emre. To know knowledge is to know yourself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture of the text, self-knowledge acts as the ultimate internal filter. The philosophy asserts that for someone who does not genuinely know themselves, words multiply endlessly.
Because they're overcompensating.
Exactly. Because they lack a solid internal foundation, they use excessive talking as a tool to continuously build and rebuild their identity in real time.
Yeah.
They are basically throwing words at the wall to see what sticks.
Which perfectly describes so much of modern digital communication. People tweeting or posting 50 times a day, not because they have 50 profound truths to share, but because they're terrified that if they stop talking, they will cease to exist.
Right.
They're verbally stumbling their way into an identity.
While conversely, the text argues that for someone who does possess deep self-knowledge, words do not need to multiply, they simply find their place.
They don't force it.
No, they don't need to speak 10 chaotic sentences when one quiet, weighed sentence will accomplish the job. The ultimate takeaway from this portion of the philosophy is that words aren't spoken merely to arrive at a destination or to win a trophy. They are spoken to avoid getting lost.
To avoid getting lost.
A true word, the text says, ends an argument, yet deepens thought. It reduces the ambient noise and clarifies the direction forward.
Here's where it gets really interesting. We've established this profound internal framework. We quiet the noise, we weigh our words, we filter them through self-knowledge, and we align with the truth instead of fighting it. But once we manage to quiet that desperate internal need to be right, something fascinating happens to our external senses. The philosophical texts we're looking at argue that once you achieve this internal quiet, the physical world outside of you, mundane things like air, water, soil, and sunlight, stops being background noise and becomes a series of profound, layered invitations.
It is a seamless transition from the internal to the external, because just as a true word is often quiet and unassuming, these everyday natural elements are entirely silent.
Yeah.
And because they are silent and because they are ubiquitous, we take them completely for granted.
I am definitely guilty of that. I'm not walking around my neighborhood every morning thinking, wow, this specific mixture of nitrogen and oxygen is really hitting the spot today.
Yeah, nobody does that.
It's just the invisible background mechanics of being alive. But if we apply the logic we just discussed, that truth reveals itself in silence, then these silent physical elements are actually incredibly loud messages if we develop the capacity to listen to them.
What's fascinating here is how the framework of these essays fundamentally reclassifies human biology and the natural world. It posits that things like reason, physical awareness, and conscience are not just ordinary, accidental biological faculties. The text explicitly defines them as entrusted gifts that carry responsibility.
The word entrusted carries a tremendous amount of philosophical weight. It completely changes the dynamic.
Oh, so?
Well, if something is a biological accident, I can just use it however I want. But if something is entrusted to me, it implies a giver, and it heavily implies a specific expectation for how I should utilize it.
Which leads to the text drawing a sharp analytical line between two vastly different ways of experiencing the physical world. It outlines the concept of material favors versus spiritual favors.
Let's break those down for us.
Material favors. So the physical warmth of the sun on your skin, the literal quenching of thirst when you drink water, these are visible and accessible to everyone, regardless of their internal state. Every living creature experiences the material favor.
The physical sensation is just the absolute baseline outer shell of the experience.
But spiritual favors, the text argues, are perceived only by those whose conscience is fully alive and functioning. To an alive conscience, every single mundane blessing isn't just a utilitarian tool for today's physical survival.
Right.
The philosophy frames it as an ongoing invitation that opens toward an eternal awakening.
Which brings us to the illustration of the fish. When I was reading through the source material, I was deeply tracking with the high-level cosmic philosophy. And then suddenly the text grounds the entire concept by talking about sitting down to eat a fresh fish.
It's a great pivot.
It was brilliant because it brought this massive abstract idea right down to the literal dinner plate in front of us. Walk us through the mechanics of how a fish can possibly speak to the human mind and heart, rather than just filling the stomach.
This is one of the most vivid explanations of what the text calls the layered language of offering. When you sit down to eat that fresh fish, the most basic foundational layer is the material reality. It addresses the stomach with calories, the eye with its presentation, the scent, the taste on the tongue.
The biological refueling process.
Exactly. That is the material favor, visible to anyone who sits at the table. But if your conscience is alive, if you possess that quiet internal truth we unpacked earlier, you naturally access the subsequent layers of the offering. The mind becomes engaged in the process.
And what is the mind here?
The text suggests that the profound delight of the mind lies in the realization, the one who created me does not forget me.
Wow. Which fundamentally shifts the act of eating. It goes from a mindless consumption of protein to receiving a highly personalized, intentional message. It is an acknowledgement of your specific existence in the universe.
And the mechanism goes one layer deeper, reaching the heart. The delight of the heart, according to this framework, lies in experiencing pure gratitude directed to the Creator. It ceases to be a transactional meal. It becomes a connection to the infinite.
That's beautiful.
And the source makes a striking theological claim here. It argues that for an infinite power, creating the vast, incomprehensible hereafter is mathematically no more difficult than creating that single specific fish on your plate.
Which levels the entire playing field of how we view miracles. We look at a fish and we think, oh, that's just normal, everyday evolutionary nature. I can buy that at the supermarket.
Right.
And then we look at the concept of eternity or the cosmos and think, that is an incomprehensible, staggering miracle. But the text is asserting that to an infinite creator, the engineering of that fresh fish is just as miraculous and requires the exact same infinite capacity as eternity itself.
When you internalize that scale, the source argues, it completely transforms mindless consumption into active, profound gratitude. You aren't just ingesting a meal, you are participating in a layered, ongoing spiritual dialogue with the universe.
But this introduces a massive, glaring question, which the text directly tackles under the concept of the trial of will.
Yes, the trial of will.
If the world is actually packed full of these beautiful layered invitations, if the fish and the soil and the sunlight are all explicitly pointing toward this deep eternal awareness, why isn't everyone seeing it? Why is the world still so incredibly full of people aggressively shouting in the crowded square, entirely missing the point?
This dives into the psychological and philosophical mechanics of human freedom. The text states, at the center of the trial stands the will.
The will.
The door to reason has been opened for humanity, but the will has been set entirely free. Within this theological framework, God does not force the human being to see the spiritual layers. He doesn't forcefully compel belief or gratitude.
Because if we were biologically or spiritually forced to see it, the gratitude wouldn't actually have any value. It wouldn't be love or appreciation. It would just be robotic programming, executing a script.
The text explicitly notes that the divine elevates humanity specifically by granting this dangerous freedom. What is considered valuable within this philosophy isn't a compelled, forced choice, but a difficult path chosen with clear awareness.
You have to choose to see it.
Yes, you possess the absolute freedom to just eat the fish, consume the calories, and completely ignore the deeper layers. You have the freedom to stand in the crowded square and shout at the top of your lungs, completely ignoring the quiet truth.
But exercising that freedom poorly comes with a severe risk. The text points out that the real existential danger we face in life isn't necessarily the blessing itself, but the act of fundamentally misreading the blessing.
Think about the mechanics of what happens when a human being misreads a profound gift. You take the immense intelligence and reason you were gifted, and instead of utilizing it to seek out quiet truth or build connection, you weaponize it to win trivial arguments on the internet or humiliate a coworker.
Which happens constantly.
That morphs the blessing into pride. You take the wealth or influence you were given, and instead of viewing it as a responsibility entrusted to you for the benefit of others, you view it as undeniable proof of your own inherent superiority.
Right. It feeds the ego.
And that morphs the blessing into arrogance and selfishness. The text specifically refers to these as the corrupted forms of blessing.
It's like being gifted a state-of-the-art, unbelievably powerful smartphone, and instead of using it to access the sum total of human knowledge or connect with people across the globe, you just use it as a makeshift paperweight to prop up a wobbly table in your house, just so you can show off to your guests that you're rich enough to own one.
That is a highly accurate analogy.
You recognize the material object, but you completely tragically miss the actual utility and purpose of the gift.
Exactly. You identified the surface-level material value, but completely ignored the entrusted spiritual utility. And this is exactly why the text concludes that maintaining a state of continuous spiritual connection, often referred to as prayer or active mindfulness within these frameworks, is the ultimate preservation of the blessing.
It keeps you grounded.
It acts as the mechanism that keeps the human heart vital. constantly reminding the mind of the giver and actively preventing those beautiful gifts from rotting into toxic pride.
So what does this all mean for you, the learner, as you go about your week? We started this deep dive standing in the middle of a crowded square, deafened by the exhausting noise of everyone desperately needing to prove they are right, burdened by the heavy armor of information overload.
It's an exhausting place to be.
And through the framework of these philosophical writings, we have traced a path toward a much quieter, more grounded reality.
The sources propose a complete paradigm shift. They ask us to move from the endless exhaustion of shouting into the immense relief of the quiet truth. They suggest that the heavy burden you carry isn't the truth of your circumstances, but the exhausting daily defenses you build to avoid aligning with it.
And the philosophy outlines how, once we clear that internal noise, once we finally stop utilizing our words just to win arguments and build fake identities, our perception of the external world completely transforms.
It changes everything.
The utterly mundane elements of your daily life, the air in your lungs, the sunlight hitting your desk, a simple piece of fresh fish on your plate, they stop being just invisible background noise or utilitarian fuel.
Yeah.
They become intentionally entrusted gifts.
Invitations, really.
Yes, they operate as layered spiritual invitations, asking you to balance your fear and hope, and urging you to treat your reason and your conscience not as biological accidents, but as sacred trusts.
It is a profound shift from mindless reactive consumption to intentional active gratitude. It moves the human experience from the realm of chaotic compulsion into the conscious, deliberate exercise of free will.
It really does offer a lens that changes how you interact with almost everything.
And I want to leave you, our listener, with one final provocative thought to ponder as you step back out into that noisy, demanding world.
Go for it.
We have thoroughly explored how these texts argue that truth is found in giving up the need to be right, and how everyday blessings are actually layered invitations designed to test our free will. So, consider this application. What if the very next time you find yourself locked in a bitter, frustrating disagreement with a colleague or a family member, what if you actively stopped viewing their opposing perspective as a dangerous threat to your own rightness?
Oh, that's challenging.
What if instead you utilized this philosophy and treated that very disagreement as a layered spiritual offering? A highly specific trial of your will designed in that exact frustrating moment to test the vitality of your conscience, to humble your corrupted pride, and to actively refine your own quiet truth.
The next time you find yourself seated at that chaotic, deafening dinner party, maybe the most profound, radical thing you can do is just put down your shield, pick up your fork, and finally taste the meal you've been entrusted with.